So thanks for joining today. I'm going to talk a little bit about using artificial intelligence and specifically natural language processing to read patient charts, essentially to understand the full patient story. So just to give a little background about Realyze Intelligence, we are a startup company that incubated out of the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Prior to that, a lot of the founders spent a lot of time in healthcare, speech recognition, the company called M-Modal. But essentially what we're doing is we're using the latest techniques, both with NLP and artificial intelligence, to understand all of the information about a patient, really to help with very tactical activities such as prioritizing patients for clinical trials, understanding kind of which patients are at higher risk, and then ultimately getting this true patient story to help manage and provide better care. To kind of talk a little bit about the problem that we're addressing today, those that aren't as familiar with healthcare, the enterprise data warehouses and the electronic medical records are really the center of the world. And one of the things that most people don't know is most of the data in those repositories are not structured. So these are clinical notes that physicians and clinicians write. And what happens is about 70% of what's detail about the patient gets trapped in these unstructured narrative descriptions of what's going on. The structured data is really used for billing purposes, but really what's talking about what's going on with the patient. And it's really unfortunate that a lot of people have done analysis and we actually know a lot more about our dry cleaning of where that's going than when we do what's going on with a patient, especially when they're in the hospital. The other problem with the EMRs, they're very episodic. So when you're in the hospital or you're visiting your doctor, you'll get that information. It'll be in that little capsule, but looking across a chronic condition such as cancer across a patient's lifespan is really hard to put all that pieces together. And what happens is you have this breakdown of you have the care team working with the patients, creating this data, creating this documentation, and then you have all this other activity as far as managing the patient. So looking for which clinical trial will best match that patient, tumor board management of what's the best treatment for these patients, research and so on. All of those require a clinical person to read those notes, understand what is being done, and put those pieces back together. And so this is the problem that Realyze Intelligence is focused on addressing. And we're doing this in a different way than traditionally has been done. A lot of the natural language processes in AI and healthcare has been built very use case specific and for a specific purpose. So coding, pulling out a billing code, or trying to create a risk of a certain disease like sepsis or so forth. What we did is we took all of the data coming in, so understand and normalize it so that you don't just have all this kind of different ways that documentation was created. We use the latest and greatest NLP to extract the information and map those to standard classifications and label those. But you can imagine for any given patient, there could be hundreds, if not thousands, of documents over the course of their lifetime. And understanding how those pieces put together is really where Realyze Intelligence uses our clinical expertise in the AI to understand at a patient level. So if you take something as simple as what stage a cancer is, the progression over time is you just look at each document, it will change, and then you might have a pathology report it one way and a radiology report a different way. That intelligence at the patient level is really the key because you're presented with all this noise. So what we do here at Realyze is we understand what that means for a patient, and then we make that available and actionable for many purposes. So instead of just purpose-building it and training the engine for coding or for clinical trials, we understand that patient and then represent it as a patient finding, then can be reused for many purposes for there. And you can see some of the things that you can start to understand for the, obviously the disease state, which medications are patients on, and then understand the correlation between those. A patient was given this sort of treatment, here was the outcome, that didn't work, they were given another treatment. So understanding the longitudinal view of those patients is a key part of how do you decide what you do next. And then that data can be used for other machine learning algorithms to predict, what's the risk of this patient developing a further disease and a further complication. And then there's also things in there, SDOH, which is social determinants of health, which is a lot of the environmental pieces of healthcare. Does the patient live alone? Do they have access to transportation? Is there food insecurity? These are things that you might have the genomic testing that will tell you if you're, if there's a possibility that you'll develop a certain disease, but knowing the social determinants of health is a key part of it. So again, putting all that information back together is the key, and then again, representing it as a patient to do that. To talk a little bit about results, this is a sample set we did for one of our clients where we took 60,000 of their oncology patients, and you can see that of 60,000 patients, that generated greater than 10 million documents. So these are everything from a radiology report to a pathology report to even a visit to the ER. All of those documents create a story, a narrative of what's going on with that patient. So what we did is we took those in. These came from various data sources. So another challenge in healthcare is each institution will implement a different electronic medical record, and there's no standards on how these documents are put together or what they have to be. So we normalize the information from Epic, Cerner, other health vendors, and then we normalize that, and then we can run it through our engine first as individual documents and pull out all that information. Was this patient on this medication? Did they have a family history of certain things? The NLP is sophisticated enough now to pull all that information, and then we understand at a patient level, okay, this patient had a biopsy, it was a positive result, they were given this medication, they didn't have an outcome, here's the next step for them. Or this patient matches this latest and greatest clinical trial that a physician in a rural area had no idea even existed. The challenge today is that the volumes of interactions with patients are so high, they don't have the time to go back through the whole patient record to understand all of these subtleties that then drive these decisions making for it. The nice thing also about the solution is it's built to allow clinicians to go in and adjust these rules. So as new medications come about, as new therapeutics are developed, they can go in and adjust and say if a patient has this criteria or they have a past medical history of a certain condition or a family history, I want to flag them now to be a certain state that then can trigger alerts and so forth. To give a couple examples of what we've been able to do with this, we prioritize for clinical trials, as I talked about. We've also been able to determine patients entering a hospital, are they a high risk of having an infection, which obviously will cause issues with other patients in the hospital. We've done things where we understand the highest risk of a patient having a crash dialysis event for chronic kidney disease. So it's been very well deployed as far as different solutions and different capabilities. So is there any questions? If not, we have a booth over in the exhibit hall. I'd love to talk to anyone that's interested. Yeah, sure. What the output would look like? Yeah, sure. So interesting enough, I'll just go back here. What happens is once we find individual documents, each document is represented as a FHIR output. So if you're familiar with healthcare, it's a HL7 XML format of what that is. And then what we do is we summarize that at a patient level. So each patient would say, this patient has a stage 5 cancer, and then it would point back to which documents or document evidence that has. So we summarize the information. One of the biggest challenges with these solutions is if you ran those hundreds of documents, you would get thousands, if not millions of data points throughout the course of their life. We summarize that at a patient level using a FHIR model. Yeah, sure. So we capture all of the disease states and comorbidities using SNOMED CT as our ontology, but then we summarize it for that specific disease state. So for lung cancer, you would want to understand all of the details around the lung cancer, but then you would want to know generally what are the other comorbidities. Do they have diabetes? Do they have certain things? But you don't necessarily want to know all the details about the diabetes. So there's a lens on it for that specific disease, and we develop those at a deep level. So you get a broad sense of the comorbidities, but a deep level of the disease itself. But excellent questions.
Then that's all, I guess. This is a big topic. If you want to have a discussion later about it, I'll be more than happy. There's a lot of lesson learned, yeah.